The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day like any other, which in retrospect seems a particularly cruel irony. It was thin, official-looking, with a return address from a law firm I'd never heard of in a town I vaguely recalled from childhood summer drives, Oakhaven, nestled somewhere deep in the wooded, rolling hills of the state's western arm. My uncle Elias had lived out there, a reclusive figure even within our already loosely knit family. I hadn't seen him in perhaps 20 years, not since I was a boy more interested in climbing trees than in the quiet, intense man who smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. The solicitor, a Mr. Abernathy, used polite, measured prose to inform me of Elias Thorne's passing. My uncle had died peacefully in his sleep, the letter stated, a phrase that always sounded more like a hopeful assumption than a confirmed fact. There was a brief, almost perfunctory expression of condolence, followed by the core of the missive. Elias had left his entire estate to me, his only living nephew. The estate, as it turned out, consisted primarily of the Thorne family farmhouse, its surrounding acreage, and whatever contents remained within. My first reaction was a muted surprise, quickly followed by a sense of detachment. Elias had always been an enigma. My mother, his younger sister, had spoken of him with a mixture of affection and exasperation, hinting at eccentricities that had only deepened with age. He'd never married, never had children, and had, by all accounts, retreated further into his solitary world after my grandparents passed. The inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a responsibility I hadn't asked for, a loose end from a life I barely knew. Abernathy requested I make arrangements to visit Oakhaven at my earliest convenience to discuss the particulars and take possession of the property. I called his office the next day. His voice was dry, like rustling leaves, but he was efficient. We set a date for the following week. I remember feeling a strange sort of obligation, a duty to this man who was blood, even if he was practically a stranger. I told myself it would be a brief trip, assess the property, sign some papers, probably put the place up for sale. I had my own life, my own career as an architectural historian, a comfortable, if somewhat predictable, existence in the city. A dilapidated farmhouse miles from anywhere didn't feature in my plans. The drive to Oakhaven took the better part of a day. The city's concrete tendrils gradually gave way to sprawling farmland, then to denser, older forests that crowded the narrow, winding roads. Oakhaven itself was little more than a crossroads, a cluster of aging buildings that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the encroaching wilderness. Abernathy's office was a small, clapboard building with peeling paint, squeezed between a dormant general store and a silent, steepled church. Mr. Abernathy was as desiccated in person as his voice had suggested, a thin man with watery eyes behind thick spectacles. He led me through the necessary legalities with a practiced air, documents signed and notarized with quiet efficiency. He handed me a large, old-fashioned iron key. "This is for the front door," he said, his gaze steady. "The property is about 5 miles further down Old Creek Road. It's been in your family for generations, Mr. Thorne. Since your great-great-grandfather, I believe." There was a faint emphasis on the word generations that I didn't quite register at the time, or perhaps dismissed as local sentimentality. He offered no further details about Elias's passing, nor did he seem inclined to small talk. The meeting concluded with a handshake that felt like grasping a bundle of dry twigs. Old Creek Road was more of a suggestion than a maintained thoroughfare. It was unpaved, deeply rutted in places, and the trees pressed in close, their branches interlacing overhead to form a gloomy tunnel. My car bounced and rattled, the silence of the woods broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my tires and the occasional cry of an unseen bird. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, I saw it. The Thorne farmhouse stood on a slight rise, overlooking a sweep of overgrown meadow that sloped down to a dark, tree-lined creek. It was a 2-story clapboard structure, stark and weathered, its paint faded to a ghostly gray. Several windows were dark, like vacant eyes. A wide porch sagged on one end, and the chimney leaned at a precarious angle. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, steeped in a profound and unsettling stillness. The air here was different, heavy and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something subtly metallic and faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. I parked the car near a dilapidated barn, its roof caved in on one side. The only sound was the sighing of wind through the tall pines that ringed the property. It was utterly isolated. No other houses were visible, no distant hum of traffic, just the vast, indifferent wilderness. A shiver, not entirely from the cool air, traced its way down my spine. The iron key turned in the lock with a protesting groan. The front door opened into a dim hallway. Dust lay thick on everything, disturbed only by what looked like the faint tracks of small animals. The air inside was stale, heavy with the trapped silence of years. To the left was a parlor, furniture draped in white sheets like slumbering ghosts. To the right, a dining room, a long table coated in a patina of grime. Straight ahead, a narrow staircase led to the upper floor. It was exactly what I'd expected, and yet profoundly more unsettling. This wasn't just an old house, it was a mausoleum of forgotten lives. I moved from room to room, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The kitchen was primitive, with a rusted wood-burning stove and a hand pump at the sink. Upstairs, bedrooms held simple, sturdy furniture, beds stripped bare, dressers empty. Everything spoke of a life pared down to its essentials, a life lived in deliberate isolation. Then I found his study. It was at the back of the house, overlooking the creek. Unlike the other rooms, this one felt intensely personal, almost vibrating with the lingering presence of its former occupant. Books crammed every shelf, spilling onto the floor in precarious stacks. The subjects ranged from local history and folklore to arcane treatises on forgotten religions and philosophies. A large, oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, notebooks, and an assortment of strange, meticulously labeled objects: rocks, dried herbs, pieces of rusted metal. But it was what covered the walls that stopped me cold. Tacked up everywhere, overlapping in a chaotic yet somehow deliberate pattern, were genealogical charts, dozens of them. Hand-drawn, meticulously detailed, tracing the Thorne family line back for centuries. Names and dates formed a complex, sprawling web. My name was there, near the bottom of one of the larger charts, a recent addition in Elias's spidery handwriting. Marcus Thorne, B 1989. My gaze drifted upwards, following the direct mail line. My father, Richard Thorne, D 1993. His older brother, Arthur Thorne, D 1985. My grandfather, Samuel Thorne, D 1959. His brother, William Thorne, D 1952. The names went on, ascending into the past. Elijah, Thomas, John, another Samuel. Each male name was accompanied by 2 dates, birth and death. A strange prickling sensation started at the base of my neck. I leaned closer, tracing the lines with my finger. My father, Richard, born 1959, died 1993, age at death, 34. His brother, Arthur, born 1951, die 1985, age at death, 34. My grandfather, Samuel, born 1925, die 1959, age at death, 34. His brother, William, born 1918, died 1952, age at death, 34. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. A coincidence. A morbid, statistical anomaly. I scrambled through the names, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. Elijah Thorne, B 1891, D 1925, Age 34, Tomas Thorne, B 1857, D 1891, Age 34, John Thorne, B 1823, D 1857. Age 34, Samuel Thorne the Elder, B 1789, D 1823, age 34. Back and back it went, an unbroken chain of men, each one meeting their end in their 34th year. The realization hit me with physical force, like a blow to the chest. It was impossible. Statistically, ludicrous. Yet there it was, laid out in my uncle's obsessive, undeniable script. I sank into Elias's worn leather chair, my mind reeling. The silence of the house pressed in, no longer just still, but suffocating. I looked at my own name again on the chart. Marcus Thorne, B 1989. I had turned 33 a few months ago. My next birthday would be my 34th. A cold dread, unlike anything I had ever experienced, began to seep into me, chilling me to the bone. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a legacy of a different, terrifying kind. My uncle hadn't just been an eccentric recluse. He had been a researcher, a chronicler of a doom that seemed to stalk the men of our bloodline. On the desk, amidst the clutter, lay a thick, leather-bound journal, Elias's journal. His handwriting, the same precise script as on the charts, filled its pages. I reached for it, my hand trembling slightly. The first entry was dated almost 40 years prior, the last, only a few weeks before his death. I didn't open it immediately. I couldn't. I stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the darkening woods. The beauty of the place, which might have appealed to me under other circumstances, now seemed menacing. The trees were too close, the shadows too deep. The creek whispered secrets I didn't want to hear. The initial plan to quickly dispense with the property evaporated. How could I? This farmhouse, this land, seemed inextricably linked to the chilling pattern Elias had uncovered. His study was not just a room of books and papers. It was an archive of a generational curse. My professional mind, the part of me trained to analyze historical structures and their stories, tried to assert itself. There had to be a rational explanation, genetic predisposition to some rare illness, a series of tragic, unrelated accidents, but the sheer consistency, generation after generation, defied such easy dismissals. 34, always 34. I thought of my father. He'd died in a car accident. A drunk driver, they said. I was only 4. My memories of him were fragmented, hazy. My mother rarely spoke of the accident, the pain too raw even after all those years. Uncle Arthur, his older brother, had apparently drowned on a fishing trip. Again, before my time, or at least before my memory could reliably hold him. What about the others? Elias's charts didn't specify causes of death, only the stark, final dates. Abernathy's words came back to me. It's been in your family for generations. Had he known? Did the town of Oakhaven whisper about the Thorns and their ill-fated men? The thought sent another wave of unease through me. Night was falling rapidly now, the light outside the study window fading to a deep, bruised purple. I hadn't brought much with me, expecting only a short trip. No food, no change of clothes beyond what was in my overnight bag. The sensible thing would be to drive back to Oakhaven, find a motel, try to process this information from a safe distance. But I couldn't leave, not yet. The journal lay on the desk, a silent invitation to delve deeper into the mystery that had apparently consumed my uncle's life, and now, it seemed, threatened my own. The house was cold, a penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I found an old oil lamp, its chimney smudged but intact. After a search, I located a can of kerosene and some matches in the kitchen. The lamp cast a flickering, uncertain light, pushing back the encroaching shadows in the study, but also making them dance in unsettling ways. With the lamp burning beside me, I finally opened Elias's journal. His first entries were observations of the farm, notes on repairs, comments on the weather, mundane details. But gradually, the tone shifted. He wrote of discovering old family Bibles, letters, and diaries tucked away in attics and trunks. He mentioned the first time he noticed the peculiar coincidence of the ages at death. October 12th, 1984, one entry read, "Arthur gone. They say he slipped, hit his head, fell from the boat. He was always a strong swimmer, 34. Just like father and grandfather, this cannot be mere chance. There is a pattern here, a terrible symmetry." Arthur was my other uncle, the one who had supposedly drowned. Elias would have been in his late 20s then. His research, it seemed, had begun in earnest after Arthur's death. The journal entries became more focused, detailing his trips to county archives, his correspondence with distant relatives, his painstaking construction of the family trees that now adorned the walls. I read for hours, the silence of the house broken only by the rustle of pages and the soft hiss of the lamp. Elias wrote of local legends, whispers about the Thorn Land, tales of bad luck, and unexplained disappearances that predated even our family's ownership. He documented his growing conviction that some force, some entity or ancient curse, was tied to this place, or perhaps to the Thorn bloodline itself. His later entries were more erratic, filled with a creeping paranoia. He wrote of strange sounds at night, of feeling watched, of a growing pressure in the air as his own 34th birthday approached. He had outlived it, though. Elias had died an old man, not a young one cut down in his prime. Why? How had he broken the pattern? Or had he merely been a chronicler, not a victim? But he was a Thorn male. The charts were unequivocal. Then I found it, a note scribbled in the margin of a page detailing the death of an ancestor named Josiah Thorn in 1789, also at 34. The note read, "Not all Thorn males, only those of the direct inheriting line, or those who reside here." My blood ran cold. Elias had never married, never had children. He was the end of his particular branch. My father was his younger brother. I was my father's only son. I had inherited the farmhouse. I was residing here. The lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. A floorboard creaked upstairs. My heart leaped into my throat. I told myself it was just the old house settling, the wind, my frayed nerves. But the dread was a living thing now, coiling in my stomach. I had to know more. I had to understand what Elias had discovered, or what he had believed he'd discovered. My life, it seemed, might depend on it. Selling the farmhouse was no longer an option. Running away felt like a fool's errand if this thing, whatever it was tied to my blood. I had to stay. I had to investigate. The decision settled in me with a grim certainty. I would stay at the Thorn farmhouse. I would sift through Elias's research, his books, his collections of strange objects. I would try to find answers, to understand the nature of this curse, this sentence that hung over the men of my family. And I would do it before my 34th birthday arrived, a date that now loomed in my mind like a ticking executioner's clock. Sleep was impossible that first night. I dozed fitfully in Elias's chair, the journal open in my lap, the oil lamp burning low. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The silence itself felt charged, expectant. I felt like an intruder, yet also, terrifyingly, like I had finally come home to a destiny I never knew awaited me. The weight of generations seemed to press down on the old farmhouse, and I, the last of this particular Thorn line, was now caught beneath it. The long, dark year ahead of me stretched out like an abyss. The next morning I drove into Oakhaven. The town looked different in the daylight, less a forgotten relic and more a community clinging stubbornly to existence. I bought groceries, tools, more kerosene for the lamps, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I also bought a new set of locks for the doors, a practical measure that felt pitifully inadequate against the intangible threat I perceived. As I paid for my goods, the storekeeper, a woman with wary eyes, looked me over. "You staying out at the old Thorn place?" she asked, her voice neutral. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound casual. "It was my uncle's." She nodded slowly. Elias kept to himself, always did. There was a pause. "This is quiet country. Takes some getting used to." Her words, though simple, seemed laden with unspoken meaning. I wondered what she knew, what stories circulated in the town about my family and our isolated farm, but I didn't press. I wasn't ready to share my uncle's terrifying discovery, not until I understood more myself. To voice it aloud felt like giving it more power. Back at the farmhouse, I began the systematic task of exploring, cleaning, and securing the place. It was a large house, bigger than it appeared from the outside, with a damp, stone-walled cellar and a sprawling attic filled with the detritus of generations. Dusting off furniture, sweeping floors, repairing a broken window pane, these mundane activities were a welcome distraction, a way to impose some semblance of order on the encroaching chaos I felt within. But always, my thoughts returned to Elias's study, to the charts and the journals. That room became the center of my existence. I spent hours there each day, poring over his research. He had collected newspaper clippings of accidents and unexplained deaths from all over the county, not just those related to our family. He seemed to be searching for a wider pattern, some common denominator. There were notes on local geology, on water sources, on unusual animal behavior. He had even tried to map out ley lines, whatever those were. The sheer volume of his work was astounding. It was the product of a lifetime of obsession. He'd cross-referenced everything, creating a complex web of interconnected information. Some of it seemed like the ramblings of a man unmoored from reality. Theories about telluric currents, ancient rituals, dimensional weaknesses. But underlying it all was the chilling, undeniable fact of the Thorne family deaths, always at 34. I found more journals, older ones, belonging to previous generations. A great-grandfather who wrote of unsettling dreams and a feeling of being watched on the property. A great-great-uncle whose diary entries became increasingly frantic in the year leading up to his 34th birthday, culminating in a final, almost illegible scrawl. "It knows my name. It waits by the creek." He had supposedly died in a hunting accident near that very creek. The creek. It featured prominently in many of the accounts. Elias had marked it on several maps, noting peculiar rock formations along its banks and areas where the vegetation grew strangely. I made a mental note to explore it myself, though a deep-seated reluctance held me back. Days turned into a week, then two. I settled into a strange routine. Mornings were for practical tasks, chopping wood for the stove. The nights were getting colder, attempting minor repairs, fetching water from the well when the hand pump in the kitchen inevitably failed. Afternoons and evenings were for the research, for immersing myself in the grim history of my family. I spoke to no one. The isolation was profound. My mobile phone had no signal here, a discovery I made with a peculiar mix of frustration and, strangely, relief. The outside world, with its demands and distractions, felt impossibly distant. Here, there was only the house, the woods, and the encroaching shadow of my 34th year. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a grim determination. I was an architectural historian. Research was my forte. I would approach this as I would any historical puzzle, piecing together clues, looking for patterns, seeking a logical explanation, however improbable it might seem. But a part of me knew this was different. This wasn't about stone and mortar, it was about blood and time. I began to notice small things. The way the silence in the house wasn't truly silent, but filled with tiny, almost imperceptible sounds, a faint scratching from within the walls, a soft sighing that wasn't the wind, a subtle creak from the floor above when I knew I was alone. I told myself it was an old house, full of drafts and rodents. My rational mind clung to these explanations. One evening, while reading in the study, I heard a distinct tapping sound. It seemed to come from the window pane. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. I looked up, my heart quickening. There was nothing there but the black reflection of the room, the flickering lamp, my own pale face staring back. The wind, I told myself, a branch brushing against the glass. But the trees nearest the study window were too far away. The tapping came again, tap, 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 clearer this time, more insistent. I forced myself to go to the window, to pull back the dusty curtain and peer out into the night. Nothing, just the dark outline of the trees against the starless sky, the faint murmur of the creek in the distance. When I turned back to the desk, one of Elias's meticulously labeled rocks, a smooth gray river stone, had fallen to the floor. It hadn't been near the edge. I picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally so. I placed it back on the desk, my hand shaking. It was the first undeniable incident, the first thing I couldn't easily rationalize away. The house was no longer just a repository of sad history. It was becoming an active participant in my investigation, or perhaps an active antagonist. My sleep, already troubled, became worse. I dreamed of the creek, of dark water and grasping hands. I dreamed of the faces in the old photographs Elias had collected, their eyes seeming to follow me. I would wake up with a jolt, heart pounding, the silence of the house pressing in on me like a physical weight. The sense of being watched was no longer confined to the property. It felt as though it was in the very air I breathed. I started talking to myself, a habit I'd never had before. Muttered questions, curses, fragments of Elias's theories. It was a way to break the oppressive silence, to feel less alone, though I knew it was a sign of the isolation taking its toll. The professional detachment I had initially tried to maintain was fracturing, eroded by fear and the relentless accumulation of a history that felt increasingly like my own future. The town of Oakhaven, which I had to visit periodically for supplies, began to feel like a distant, almost dreamlike place. The ordinary lives of its inhabitants, the mundane transactions in the store, the brief, incurious glances I received, they all seemed to belong to a different reality from the one I inhabited at the Thorn farmhouse. Each time I drove back down Old Creek Road, it felt like crossing a threshold, leaving the normal world behind and re-entering a place where the rules of logic and reason were becoming increasingly frayed. I found a locked wooden box in the attic, tucked beneath a loose floorboard. It was old, bound with tarnished brass. After some effort, I managed to pry it open. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a collection of silver objects, a small, intricately carved bird, a tarnished locket, and several thin, needle-like implements whose purpose I couldn't guess. There was also a small, leather-bound diary, much older than Elias's. The handwriting was faint, archaic. It belonged to a woman, an ancestor named Elspeth Thorn, who had lived in the mid-18th century. Her entries were sporadic, filled with references to the old ways and the spirit of the land. She wrote of making offerings, of appeasements. One passage chilled me to the core. He will come for the 34th summer, as he always does. The price must be paid, for the land, for the blood. The 34th summer, not year, summer. It was a subtle distinction, but it resonated with a horrible clarity. My 34th birthday fell in late July. Summer. Elspeth's diary didn't speak of a curse in terms of an accident or illness. It spoke of something sentient, something that came for its due. This discovery marked a turning point. The abstract fear began to coalesce into something more specific, more terrifying. This wasn't just a pattern of unfortunate deaths, it was a ritual, a sacrifice. And the farmhouse, the land itself, was the altar. Elias, in all his research, had cataloged the deaths, but had he understood this? Elspeth's diary suggested a deeper, older knowledge within the family, a grim acceptance of a terrible bargain. The air in the house grew heavier still. Sometimes, I would catch a fleeting scent, the same one I'd noticed on my first arrival, metallic and faintly sweet, like rotting apples or blood. It would linger for a moment, then vanish, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it. Objects continued to move. A book would be open to a different page. A door I had closed would be ajar. These were small things, deniable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of subtle, unnerving harassment. I began to document everything just as Elias had. My own journal, a plain notebook bought in Oakhaven, started to fill with observations, theories, and expressions of a growing dread. I felt a strange kinship with my dead uncle, a shared descent into a mystery that consumed us both. But where his research seemed to have been a lifelong, almost academic pursuit until perhaps his own final years, mine was a race against time. One afternoon, I decided to explore the creek. Armed with a heavy walking stick and Elias's hand-drawn map, I pushed through the overgrown meadow. The creek was wider than I expected, its waters dark and sluggish, flowing between steep, loamy banks. The air here was noticeably colder, the silence deeper, broken only by the gurgle of water over unseen stones. Elias had marked several locations on his map with small, cryptic symbols. One of them was a cluster of large, moss-covered rocks that formed a sort of natural amphitheater on the far bank. As I approached, a wave of intense nausea washed over me. The sweet, metallic scent was stronger here, almost cloying. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, an overwhelming urge to turn and run. I forced myself forward. The rocks were oddly shaped, some almost seeming carved, though erosion could have accounted for it. In the center of the cluster, half buried in the mud, was a flat, dark stone, larger than the others. It looked like an altar. My stomach churned. This place felt profoundly wrong, ancient and malevolent. As I stood there, a sudden gust of wind swept down the creek bed, rustling the leaves with a sound like whispering voices. The temperature dropped several degrees. I looked around wildly, but there was nothing, only the trees, the rocks, the dark water. Then I saw it. Scratched into the surface of the altar-like stone, almost invisible beneath a layer of grime and moss, was a symbol. It was a complex, spiral-based design, vaguely familiar. I'd seen it before, in one of Elias's more esoteric books, referenced as a symbol of binding or of a gateway. A loud crack, like a branch snapping, echoed from the trees just beyond the creek. My head whipped around. I saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched intensified to an unbearable degree. This time, there was no denying it, no rationalizing it away. Something was out there, aware of my presence, something hostile. I didn't wait. I turned and scrambled back up the bank, heart hammering, the nausea threatening to overwhelm me. I didn't stop running until I reached the farmhouse, bursting through the back door and slamming it shut, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The metallic scent, faint but unmistakable, seemed to have followed me into the house. That night, the activity escalated. The scratching sounds in the walls were louder, more frantic. I heard footsteps pacing in the hallway outside the study, heavy and deliberate. Once, I thought I heard a low murmur, almost like a voice, but the words were unintelligible, lost in the creaks and groans of the old house. The oil lamp in the study flickered wildly, its flame shrinking and then flaring as if buffeted by an unseen wind, though the windows were closed and there was no draft. I barricaded myself in the study, piling furniture against the door, a futile gesture against whatever was out there, but it provided a sliver of psychological comfort. I knew with a chilling certainty that I had disturbed something by going to the creek, by acknowledging its significance. The subtle harassment had ended. This felt like a warning, or perhaps the beginning of the siege. Sleep was a distant memory. I spent the night hunched over Elias's desk, rereading Elspeth's diary and my uncle's notes on the creek, trying to piece together the terrifying puzzle. The he Elspeth referred to, was it a spirit of the land, as she seemed to believe, an entity bound to this place, demanding its due from the Thorn bloodline? The symbol on the stone, was it a key, a focus point for this power? My architectural training, my reliance on logic and evidence, felt like a flimsy shield against the encroaching darkness. What I was dealing with was not of the rational world. It was ancient, predatory, and it knew my family, it knew my name, and my 34th summer was fast approaching. The isolation was no longer just geographical, it was existential. I was alone, in a house that was both my inheritance and my prison, facing a deadline set by a force beyond my comprehension. The research had become a desperate search for survival. The following days were a blur of fear and frantic investigation. The phenomena in the house became more overt. Objects didn't just move, they were thrown. One morning, I found every book in the study pulled from the shelves and piled in the center of the room. Another time, a glass of water I'd left on the kitchen table shattered spontaneously, spraying shards across the floor. The metallic, sweet scent was a near constant presence now, sometimes faint, sometimes overwhelmingly strong, particularly near the cellar door and the attic stairs. Communication with the outside world remained impossible. I had tried the landline phone when I first arrived. It was dead, the line apparently down somewhere along the remote stretch of Old Creek Road. My mobile, as I knew, was useless. I considered driving into Oakhaven and trying to call for help, but who would I call? What would I say? That my ancestral farmhouse was haunted by a generational curse that was about to claim me. I would be dismissed as mad, and some deep, instinctual part of me knew that leaving might not make a difference. Elspeth's diary suggested the entity was tied to the bloodline and the land. Fleeing might only delay the inevitable, or worse, anger it further. One evening, driven by a desperate need for some new piece of information, some clue Elias might have overlooked, I decided to brave the cellar. He had made few notes about it, other than to say it was damp and prone to flooding in the spring. Armed with my brightest flashlight and the heavy walking stick, I unlatched the thick wooden door off the kitchen. A wave of cold, musty air, thick with the smell of damp earth and that sickeningly sweet odor, billowed out. The stone steps were slick with moisture. The flashlight beam cut a nervous swath through the oppressive darkness. The cellar was larger than I'd thought, a labyrinth of low-ceilinged chambers supported by thick stone pillars. The walls wept moisture, and the air was cloyingly heavy. Puddles of stagnant water reflected the flashlight beam like dark eyes. Old barrels, rotted wooden crates, and rusted farm implements lay scattered about, remnants of a bygone era. As I moved deeper, the beam fell upon something in a far corner. It was a section of the wall where the stonework was different, newer, or at least less ancient than the rest. It looked like a sealed-up alcove or doorway. Elias's maps of the house showed nothing here, but his plans were based on the structure as he knew it. This looked older. Curiosity, or perhaps a foolhardy desperation, overcame my fear. I examined the stonework more closely. The mortar was crumbling in places. Using the pointed end of my walking stick, I began to pry at a loose stone. It came away with surprising ease, followed by a shower of dirt and crumbling mortar. Behind it was darkness. I worked for nearly an hour, dislodging stones, the silence of the cellar broken only by my grunts of effort and the scrape of stone on stone. The sweet metallic scent grew stronger with every stone I removed, until it was almost nauseating. Finally, I had created an opening large enough to squeeze through. Shining the flashlight into the void, I saw a small, rough-hewn chamber, no more than 6 feet square. It was empty, save for a thick layer of dust and debris on the floor. But on the far wall, something was carved into the stone. I squeezed through the opening, my heart pounding, and directed the light onto the carving. It was the same spiral-based symbol I had seen on the altar stone by the creek. And beneath it, scratched crudely into the stone, were names. Dozens of them. Thorne names. John Thorne, Samuel Thorne, Elijah Thorne, generation after generation. Each name was accompanied by a single stark date, the year of their 34th birthday. It was a litany of the doomed, a hidden monument to the family curse, etched into the very foundations of the house. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a record. It felt like a dedication or a claim, as if the house itself, or something within it, was marking its victims. I scanned the names, my light trembling. Near the bottom, there was a freshly scratched space, as yet unfilled, waiting. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. Once, twice. The beam dimmed, then died, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I fumbled for my spare batteries, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp them. The silence in the small chamber was complete, a dead, breathless void. The metallic scent was overpowering, gagging me. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic thumping of my heart. Then I heard it, a sound from the main part of the cellar, beyond the opening I'd made. A soft, wet shuffling, like something heavy being dragged across the damp floor. It was getting closer. My fumbling fingers finally managed to open the flashlight, to replace the batteries. The light sprang back to life, weak at first, then strengthening. I scrambled back through the opening, scraping my arms and shoulders, and shone the beam wildly around the larger cellar space. Nothing. Only the dripping water, the silent barrels, the oppressive shadows. But the shuffling sound had stopped. Had I imagined it? In my terror, had my mind conjured it from the darkness? I didn't wait to find out. I backed away, towards the stairs, never taking my eyes off the Stygian depths of the cellar. As I reached the top step and fumbled for the door latch, I heard it again, from directly below. A low chuckle, soft, guttural, and utterly inhuman. It seemed to vibrate through the stone floor beneath my feet. I slammed the cellar door shut, ramming the bolt home, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I leaned against it, shaking uncontrollably. The laughter, if that's what it had not been my imagination. It was real, and it was down there, in my house. The discovery in the cellar, combined with the auditory horror, pushed me closer to the edge than I had ever been. Elias's research, Elspeth's diary, the altar by the creek, the hidden chamber of names, it all painted a picture of a deliberate, ancient malevolence. This wasn't a passive curse. It was an active entity, a predator. I spent the rest of that night in Elias's study, the door barricaded again, reading and rereading everything I could find about bindings, wardings, and protective rituals. Most of it was arcane nonsense, folklore, and superstition. But Elspeth Thorne had written of appeasements and the old ways. Had she known how to placate this thing? Or merely how to delay it? Her diary was frustratingly vague on specifics, filled more with fear and resignation than practical advice. Elias, too, seemed to have explored these avenues. His later journals contained sketches of symbols, notes on herbal concoctions, and references to rituals he'd considered, or perhaps even attempted. But there was no indication of success. He had survived his 34th year, but he had been the end of his direct line, unmarried, childless. Had that been his salvation? Had the entity simply passed him over, waiting for a new heir to the property, a new link in the chain of blood? The question of Elias's survival nagged at me. Why him? The charts were clear. Direct male line. He was as direct as my father. Unless the entity specifically targeted the inheritor of the land, the one who took possession. Elias had inherited from his father. But he had left the farm for many years, pursuing his academic studies, only returning in middle age. Had the distance, the time away during his crucial 34th year, somehow broken the cycle for him? Or was his survival an anomaly I couldn't yet understand? My own 34th birthday was now less than 2 months away. The summer solstice, a date Elspeth had mentioned with particular dread, was even closer. The sense of a deadline, of a closing window, was immense. I began to feel like I was not alone even in the study. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I would catch a flicker of movement, a deepening of shadow in a corner of the room. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. The temperature would drop suddenly, inexplicably, raising gooseflesh on my arms. The air would grow heavy, charged, making it difficult to breathe. One afternoon, while I was examining a particularly old map of the property, one that predated even Elspeth's time, showing the land as unsettled wilderness except for a single, strange circular marking near the creek, I heard a distinct whisper. Marcus. It was soft, sibilant, and seemed to come from directly behind me. I froze, every nerve ending screaming. Slowly, I turned. The room was empty. The door was closed, barricaded. No window was open, but I had heard it, my name, spoken in a voice that was neither male nor female, a dry, rustling sound, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Then, a faint scratching sound from the wall behind Elias's desk, the wall where the genealogical charts hung thickest. It was the sound of a fingernail, or something like it, being drawn slowly across paper. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the charts. As I watched, a new scratch mark appeared on the paper beside my name, a thin, dark line, as if someone had underscored it. This was no longer about research. This was about confrontation. The entity was making its presence known, directly, personally. It was acknowledging me, marking me. The subtle games were over. Driven by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate, primal defiance, I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace in the parlor, the only thing resembling a weapon I could find. I returned to the study, my heart hammering, the poker held tight in my sweaty grip. "What do you want?" I shouted into the empty room, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The only answer was a sudden, violent rattling of the window panes, as if a gale-force wind had struck the house, though outside the trees stood perfectly still. The papers on Elias's desk flew into the air, swirling around the room like a chaotic snowstorm. The oil lamp flared, then extinguished itself, plunging the room into the gloomy twilight filtering through the dusty windows. And in the dimness, I saw it. For a fraction of a second, a shape coalesced in the corner of the room, near the overflowing bookshelves. It was tall, impossibly thin, a silhouette of deeper darkness against the shadows. It had no discernible features, yet I felt an overwhelming sense of ancient, malevolent intelligence radiating from it. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it dissolved, melting back into the ambient gloom. I was left standing there, shaking, the poker feeling utterly useless in my hand. The display had been a clear demonstration of power, a dismissal of my feeble attempts at defiance. It could manifest. It could interact with the physical world. And it was here, with me, in the house. The days leading up to the summer solstice were a living nightmare. The manifestations grew more frequent, more aggressive. Loud bangs would erupt from empty rooms. Doors would slam shut with violent force. The metallic scent was pervasive, sometimes so strong it made my eyes water. I rarely slept, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, jumping at every sound. I ate little, my stomach constantly knotted with fear. My research had stalled. What more could I learn? I knew the history, the pattern. I knew about the creek, the altar, the hidden chamber. I knew about Elspeth's he and her desperate, vague references to appeasement. But I had no solution, no weapon against an entity that seemed to operate outside the laws of physics and reason. Elias's journals from his own 33rd and 34th years were particularly harrowing to read. He described similar phenomena, the escalating dread, the feeling of being hunted. But he also wrote of a growing resolve, a desperate plan he was formulating. He mentioned the Thorn legacy, not the curse, but something else, a duty of severance, he felt. The entries became more cryptic, filled with allusions to local folklore about a guardian of the threshold and the necessity of a willing sacrifice to close a wound in the world. Had Elias offered himself as some kind of sacrifice? But he had lived. It didn't make sense, unless the sacrifice wasn't his life, but something else. His lineage, perhaps? By remaining childless, had he starved the entity of its expected due from his branch? But that didn't explain why it was now targeting me, his nephew, the inheritor. The solstice arrived on a heavy, overcast day. The air was thick, humid, and unnaturally still. Not a leaf stirred on the trees. The silence around the farmhouse was absolute, a waiting, watchful hush. I felt a terrible pressure building, both in the atmosphere and within myself. This day felt significant, a turning point. I spent the day barricaded in the study, rereading Elias's final entries before his 35th birthday. He wrote of preparing for a confrontation, of gathering specific items, herbs mentioned in Elspeth's diary, objects he'd collected over years of research, things he believed held some protective or symbolic power. He mentioned going to the creek at dusk on the solstice. The cycle must be broken here, at its heart. He'd written, or redirected, the land thirsts, the old compact demands its price, but perhaps the price can be renegotiated. Perhaps the guardian can be appeased with a different offering. A different offering. What had he meant? As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown meadow, a profound sense of dread and inevitability washed over me. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that I had to go to the creek, just as Elias had. Whether it was to confront the entity, to attempt some desperate ritual of my own, or simply to meet my fate, I didn't know. But staying in the house felt like waiting in a trap. I gathered a few items from Elias's desk, the small silver bird I'd found in the attic box, a pouch of dried herbs Elspeth had named as sacred to the genius loci, and the oldest Thorn family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth with age. They felt like flimsy talismans against an ancient god, but they were all I had. Stepping out of the farmhouse felt like stepping into another world. The oppressive stillness was broken only by the frantic chirping of crickets, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy air. The sky was a bruised purple, the clouds tinged with a sickly orange from the setting sun. The metallic scent was stronger than ever, emanating from the direction of the creek. I walked across the meadow, each step an effort. The path Elias had worn to the creek was barely visible now, but I found my way by instinct, drawn by a horrifying sense of predestination. As I neared the tree line, the temperature dropped sharply. The gurgle of the creek sounded louder, more insistent. The clearing with the altar stone was even more menacing in the fading light. The moss-covered rocks seemed to loom like hunched figures. The altar stone itself, flat and dark, pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence that I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't been able to see in daylight. The spiral symbol carved into it seemed to shift and writhe in the gloom. I stood before it, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The silence here was different from the silence at the house. It was deeper, older, filled with an unspoken, ancient power. "I'm here," I said, my voice a ragged whisper. "What do you want?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the air around the altar stone began to shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. The faint luminescence intensified. The metallic scent became overwhelming, acrid and coppery, like fresh blood. A shape began to coalesce over the altar. It was similar to what I had glimpsed in the study, but more defined, more solid. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its form vaguely, disturbingly humanoid but utterly alien. It had no face, only a swirling darkness where features should have been, yet I felt an ancient, terrifying intelligence focused entirely on me. This was Elspeth's he, the guardian, the thing that had claimed generations of my ancestors. It didn't speak, but a voice echoed in my mind, cold and ancient, like stone grinding against stone, the blood, the land, the compact. Fear, stark and primal, threatened to paralyze me. But Elias's words, a different offering, echoed in my memory. I held out the objects I had brought, the silver bird, the herbs, the Bible. "Is this what you want?" I managed to stammer. "An offering? Appeasement?" The entity seemed to consider this. The swirling darkness of its face pulsed. The mental voice came again, dismissive. "Trinkets. The price is blood. The thorn blood. Always." So, there was no negotiation, no alternative. The curse was absolute. My 34th summer, my death. Despair washed over me, cold and bleak, but with it came a strange, desperate clarity. If I was to die, I would die on my feet, not cowering. I thought of Elias. He had faced this, somehow. He had survived. How? The entity moved then, or rather, a tendril of shadow detached itself from the main form and flowed across the altar stone towards me, like a searching serpent. I flinched back, but stood my ground. The inheritor, the vessel. The words in my mind were filled with a chilling possessiveness. Then, another memory surfaced. Elias's journal entry. Not all thorn males, only those of the direct inheriting line, or those who reside here. And his cryptic note about a duty of severance. Suddenly, a desperate, insane idea took root. The entity wanted the thorn blood tied to the land, the inheritance. If the inheritance was rejected, if the link was severed, "I don't want it," I cried out, my voice raw with desperation. "I renounce it. The house, the land, the inheritance. I reject it all." I threw the silver bird, the herbs, the Bible onto the altar stone. "Take them, take the legacy. But you can't have my blood if I am no longer part of the compact." The shadowy tendril paused. The swirling darkness of the entity's core seemed to intensify. The mental voice, when it came, was laced with something new. Surprise? Or perhaps fury. "The compact cannot be broken. The blood is bound to the land." "Then unbind it," I shouted, fueled by a mad courage I didn't know I possessed. "Elias, he found a way. He didn't give you his blood, he gave you something else. His lineage. He ended his line to starve you." Was that it? Had Elias, by choosing not to have children, by effectively ending his direct contribution to the thorn bloodline tied to this land, somehow altered the terms? Had his sacrifice been not his life, but his future, his family's continuity on this cursed ground? The entity remained motionless for a long moment. The shimmering air around it crackled with unseen energy. The pressure in my head was immense. I felt as if my skull might split. Then the mental voice came again, softer this time, almost contemplative. The chronicler, he understood sacrifice. He offered sterility, a slow ending. You offer nothing. Only denial. "I offer freedom," I yelled, though I wasn't sure what I meant. "Freedom from this cycle. If I reject the inheritance, if I walk away from this land, the compact is void for me. Your claim is on the thorn who holds this land." It was a wild gamble, based on fragmented clues and desperate hope. But what else did I have? The entity seemed to recoil slightly. The tendril of shadow retracted. The luminescence of the altar stone dimmed. The air grew less charged. To walk away is to leave the debt unpaid, the voice whispered in my mind, a hint of something that might have been regret, or perhaps a threat. The land will remember. The blood will call. Let it, I retorted, though my bravado was paper thin. I won't be another name scratched into your cellar wall. For what felt like an eternity, the entity simply stood there, a column of shifting darkness. The silence stretched, taut, and brittle. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the form began to dissipate. It didn't vanish abruptly, but rather seemed to dissolve, to melt back into the shadows of the creek bed, until only the faint, pulsing light of the altar stone remained. The oppressive presence lifted. The metallic scent faded. I stood there, trembling violently, gasping for air, unsure if I was alive or dead, sane or mad. Had it worked? Had my desperate renunciation actually broken the claim? I didn't know, but I wasn't waiting to find out. I turned and fled from the creek, stumbling through the twilight, back towards the silent, waiting farmhouse. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my bag in the back, didn't even bother to lock the farmhouse door. I just got in, started the engine, and drove. I drove through the night, away from Oakhaven, away from Old Creek Road, away from the Thorne family legacy. I didn't slow down until the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky with colors that seemed impossibly bright and clean. It's been 5 years since that night. I never went back to the farmhouse. I contacted Mr. Abernathy and instructed him to sell the property, to donate any proceeds to a historical preservation society, anything to sever my connection to it. He seemed unsurprised, merely nodding his dry, papery agreement over the phone. The sale, he later informed me, was difficult. Apparently, the Thorne place had a reputation. Eventually, the state took it for unpaid taxes. It stands empty now, I suppose, slowly surrendering to the wilderness, the creek whispering its ancient secrets to no one, or perhaps to something still waiting. My 34th birthday came and went. I spent it in a crowded city, surrounded by noise and light, as far from the silence of Oakhaven as I could get. Nothing happened. The curse, if my desperate gambit at the creek had indeed worked, had passed me by. I often think of Elias. I believe I understand him better now. He hadn't broken the curse for himself by running away in his youth. He had confronted it, but in his own way. He had chosen a life of solitary research, of chronicling the darkness, and ultimately, of sacrificing his own lineage to protect future generations that would never exist. He had become the guardian of the family's terrible secret, living with it, studying it, and in the end, perhaps, containing it through his own choices. His inheritance to me wasn't just the farm. It was the knowledge, the burden, and, ultimately, the chance to make a different choice. Sometimes late at night when the city is quiet, I catch a faint, fleeting scent, metallic and faintly sweet, and I wonder, did I truly escape, or did I merely postpone the debt? The land remembers, the voice had said. The blood will call. I don't know if the curse is broken, or merely dormant, waiting for some new, unsuspecting thorn to stumble upon that isolated patch of land. I live with that uncertainty, but I also live. And for now, that has to be enough. The shadows of the Thorne family history are long, but I have stepped out of them, into the light, even if I always feel the chill of their memory at my back. I am the thorn who walked away, and I keep walking.